for the invitation to come and share the work we're doing with the red-tailed hawk project. As Kit mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at Cornell University with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The red-tailed hawk project is something I started with some other colleagues, partly because of what I am focused on for my dissertation, but also to do a bunch of other things that are kind of outside of the scope of my dissertation work. What I've prepared for you all tonight is an overview of the project and the work we're doing, also the how and why. And I think that in doing so, I'll provide a bunch of background information. So even though I bet most of you here are quite familiar with red-tailed hawks, perhaps there's something that you can learn about the species that you didn't know before. And then also, I'm going to share a bunch of the most interesting things that we've found so far. So hopefully there's a bit of information for everybody, even if you are familiar with our project. Okay, so to start, I like to start with this photo of the red-tailed hawk. This was taken in Utah, actually, by my friend and mentor, Jerry Ligori, a few years back. And I like this photo because it really captures the beauty and the stunning nature of the red-tailed hawk, and really why we're all so enamored with this species. Even though it's quite common and we see it almost daily, it's still a species that I think most people will say that they really appreciate. It is, like I said, common and found in a lot of different places. But its distribution being so widespread is actually quite spectacular because it's what we call polytypic, and that it has 16 described subspecies that vary in their plumage characters across its distribution. That ranges from both coasts of North America, also from northern Canada all the way down to Central America. It's also found on the Caribbean islands and a few islands off the coast of Mexico. These subspecies descriptions here that you can see outlined, they generally follow changes in the habitat across the landscape. So anywhere where you see a shift in habitat, you generally see a shift in plumage in the red-tailed hawk. And here's just a few of those 16 that can show you that there's, a lot of them are subtle variations on the same theme, but there are some subspecies that are quite different in the way they look from the other red-tailed hawks, particularly the birds that breed in Costa Rica or the birds that breed in Alaska and the extreme Pacific Northwest. I also like to show this photo. These are tail spread photos of all the a subset of all of the birds that we've caught in our work. And you can see here that there's a lot of variation in this tail, in these tail patterns. And yes, some of this variation is between subspecies, so geographic variation, but there's a lot of variation that also occurs within a particular subspecies. This variation is pretty amazing because you can see, even though this is the red-tailed hawk, there are many members, or there are many individuals that don't have any red in their tail at all. The other really neat thing about this species is that it is what we call polymorphic in its plumage. For those of you that are unfamiliar with this term, it basically means that in a portion of the distribution, we can find light and dark types, and that's shown here in the illustration. This is basically what it looks like for the red-tailed hawk. You get these dark types and light types, and yes, there's some variation in between. But they're polymorphic in plumage, so there's a lot of diversity in the appearance of this species. Generally, we have considered that the polymorphic subspecies occur in the western part of the distribution, in the Northwest, in Alaska, and parts of northern Canada. Most of the individuals up there are actually dark. As you move south into your area in California, you do see dark types, but they're much less common than the light types. And then down into Central America, they become increasingly less common. Another interesting thing about the species is that if you look at this eBird status and trends map, although this species is quite common, we all consider it common, we see it every day, it is among the species that is on the decline. As you can see in this status and trends map, where you see those red marks are indicate a decrease in the abundance during the breeding season of the species in particular areas of its distribution. So this is a good species to focus on in an effort, not only, we have a lot of conservation priorities for imperiled species that maybe are less common, but we also need to make sure that we're working to keep the common birds common, and this is a species that is a good example of one that we might not consider is on the decline, but when we look at the data, it actually is. So now I'm going to shift into showing you, now you have a little bit of background about the species. I want to shift into showing you a little bit about our project, what we are doing and why, and how we're going about it. I think our mission can be summed up in pretty simply in that we are conducting research and we're communicating it, we're attempting to communicate it broadly. And what that means, what does it mean to communicate it broadly? Well, I think that this photo taken by my friend Greg is a good example of that. This was taken in Idaho, Southwest Idaho, when I was out trapping birds during the breeding season, and I caught this individual. And to take these photos that I'm going to show you here in a little bit, we have to go to where there's not there's some shade, so we don't have any harsh lighting from the sun. Generally in Southwest Idaho, that correlates with people's houses. Even though this is quite rural area, I stopped in front of these people's houses and started working on this hawk, and these kids noticed and they came out and wanted to know what I was up to. So I was able to show them what I was doing, and I taught them a little bit about red-tailed hawks. And they knew about the hawks, they'd seen them before, but they didn't know what they were called. They didn't know really anything about their life history or the biology. So in this 10 or 15 minutes that they were exposed to this, I think I was hoping that I sparked their interest, at least in the natural world. And that's what I mean about communicating our research broadly. We're trying to share the work we're doing to anybody who might find it interesting. And we're trying to communicate it in a way that is digestible for anybody. That's why I'm here talking to you guys today, is because I want to make sure that anybody that wants to know about what we're doing and what we're learning has an opportunity. One way that we're doing that is our website, redtailedhawkproject.org. And if you haven't been there to check out the website, I encourage you to do so. I just want to highlight some things that I think are the most interesting parts of the website, or the most useful. We have a blog, and the blog essentially acts as a newsreel for things that happen as we're doing our research, things that are necessarily going to show up in publications, or just interesting tidbits as we're conducting our research. This blog also shows up on Facebook, so if that's the way you consume your media, you can like us on Facebook. There's also a research tab that gives a broad overview of the research that we're doing, including, for instance, the movement ecology work we're doing. It describes why we're focused on the things we're focused on and what we're hoping to learn. And then there's also the subspecies page, and the subspecies page includes this subspecies map that I showed you previously. So if, after this talk, if you want to revisit the distribution of each of these subspecies and try and learn them if you don't know them and lock them in your head, you can go there and find that out. But you can also scroll down on the page and you'll find that each subspecies has a plate that shows the overview of the plumage for that subspecies. Now, I'm still building this portion. It's currently available for you to peruse, but it's incomplete. I'm still illustrating all this. But in the end, I'm hoping that it'll be a complete guide to understanding, when you're out, when you're traveling, when you're going birding or anything, you can see a red-tailed hawk, and you can see the ID points that make it a particular subspecies and actually tell what it is. And that's fun for you folks, places like the Great Plains, where you get a lot of these subspecies occurring together during the winter. You can have fun trying to identify them. The other fun part about the subspecies page is that for each subspecies that it applies to, there's a link that goes to the Macaulay library. We can actually look through all the photos for that particular subspecies, in this case, borealis, which is the subspecies in the eastern North America. So hopefully you understand a little bit more about our mission. I'm going to transition now into our research and what we're focused on for our research. And generally what we're trying to do is we're trying to fill knowledge gaps in the life history, in the biology of the species, but also the evolutionary history of the species. And this might surprise you, but even though this species is common, everybody knows about it, there's actually a lot of research that has not been done on this species, and there's a lot of knowledge gaps that are important to fill if, for instance, we're going to make sure that we keep this common bird common. I think that one of our main objectives, or what you can see the work we're trying to do, is trying to pinpoint areas in the species account of the birds of the world as a way to figure out what don't we know about this species. But I think we're also trying to gear our research to pipe in information to the birds of the world accounts to make them more robust, taking birds of the world accounts to the next level using the red-tailed hawk. Our approach to research is really centered on the extended specimen. And if you've never heard of the idea of the extended specimen, it comes from the research world, or the museum world, where you have this round skin preserved in a drawer. And when this round skin was collected, it was collected with a bunch of information that that applies to that individual. And the extended specimen concept is this idea of taking as much information as you can whenever you collect or get an individual in the hand. So we're doing that with voucher specimens, but we're also doing it with standardized photographs to act as this anchor point for all the data we take. It serves as a visual record of that bird, but it's really the digital representation of that individual that we have taken a bunch of data on. These photographs, we take them against a gray board, a neutral background that looks like this, and then with the color standard, that thing down in the middle, or I'm sorry, down in the right-hand corner, that color standard allows us to, after we take the photos, to standardize all the photos between everything that we take to make sure that the color, exposure, and everything is matched, so we can more properly compare the plumages of all these individuals. It also allows us to standardize the photos so we can extract coloration data from all these informations to use in analyses. We take a standardized set of photos. Everybody in our working group takes the same photos the same way. And these photos are meant to capture the plumage, the entire plumage of the individual, really to catalog the entire plumage. And so all the photos are to make sure that we capture every single part of the body. And what we have now is a set of really in-depth photographs for every individual that is in our database. And you can actually go and explore these photos. If you go into the Macaulay Library and filter by in-hand photos for red-tailed hawk, you'll find all of our birds taken against these gray boards, and they're really fun to look through and see. And that's one way where you can explore the plumage diversity in the species and get to know it. So I encourage you all, if you're interested in red-tailed hawks, to look through these photos. They're a lot of fun. We have, juvenile, adult, tons of different subspecies from a lot of the distribution. And we're adding, essentially every day we're adding an individual or so because we have so many people out there collecting data for our group. So here's just some more examples of that plumage diversity that we're capturing from these photos. And you can see how between these individuals, each of these photos are standardized. So this approach, what it gives us is, here's an example of all the different data that we're taking for every individual. You can imagine that for that individual with a photo, we've taken blood samples for genetic work. We've taken an age. We've gathered information on molt, sex. For some individuals, that individual is attached to a breeding location. And then we're putting transmitters out. So some individuals also have movement data attached to them. And these can be taken together in aggregate, quite powerful for answering questions. So really what we're doing for the red-tailed hawk is building large-scale data sets and bringing raptor research, particularly for the red-tailed hawk, into a big data realm, which gives us a lot more power to answer questions about the species and its ecology. I want to highlight a little bit about our movement work because it's a really special part of our research program. This picture here that shows all those tracks is actually quite outdated now. We have over almost 150 individuals in our movement data set that span almost the entire distribution of populations that migrate. And we're really there's so much information to fill in this aspect of the species biology. We're gaining insight from a very descriptive level of where they go, when, and why, to empowering more high-level questions about the species movement ecology. And the way we go about this is we're using this technology called they're GPS units, but they're called GSM units, and they function off the cellular network. And you can imagine these satellite transmitters that we're putting on the backs of these birds, they function just like your cell phone. So anytime you move about the landscape and you have cell service, those birds are also going to have cell service. And when they have cell service, we've programmed them to take locations at a certain interval and then communicate back to us that data. So we essentially right now are getting data from individuals if they're in service once a day on our phones. So we have an app, we can actually look and monitor our individuals on our phones and see what they're doing. You can imagine we have all these individuals that move north in areas like northern Canada and Alaska. They go out of cell range and during the summer when they go to breed, and we don't hear from them for the entire summer. And when they come back south, they offload all that summer data and we get a full perspective on where they've been for that summer. It's pretty fun. This is Nick, who's one of the main participants in the Red-tailed Hawk Project, holding a bird that he put a tag on in northern Michigan. Nick is a PhD student at Michigan State University, and I just want to highlight some of the work he's doing because it's pretty cool. Nick is focused on this area in the Great Lakes, and he really wants to understand how the Great Lakes impact red-tailed hawk migration, particularly this place in Mackinac City in northern Michigan. At this spot, there's this 5-mile stretch of water that raptors moving north have to cross. And red-tails, they don't really like flying over water. So they really need the conditions to be just right to make this 5-mile stretch or 5-mile cross to the northern part of Michigan on their way north. And here's just an animation from a bird that Nick and I tagged in this area, just to show you what these birds do when they reach this spot. As they funnel up north, they get to this place where they have to cross. And at this point, you can imagine there's hundreds of birds in the air doing the same thing, hundreds of red-tailed hawks. It's quite spectacular. At some point, conditions change, and that bird decides that it's time to move across the strait, and they make the jump and end up on the northern peninsula and continue their route north to their breeding grounds. Nick's really interested in this behavior and what factors are involved in it. And what he's found out from all the birds that he has trapped is shown in this figure. The really light orange tracks are birds that have jumped shorter distances across the water and kind of milled about on the island and have waited to get across using simpler, shorter distance crossings. He's determined those are suboptimal. And then he's got birds that just make that straight shot across a 5-mile stretch and term those optimal. So what makes a bird choose an optimal route versus a suboptimal route? We currently just submitted a paper based on this, and for those of you interested, it'll show up on the blog when it's published. It is really interesting stuff. So if you're interested in this type of a question, stay tuned. Like I said, other aspects of our movement work are more basic. We're just trying to understand where certain birds during the winter actually breed and what routes they take. So here's a good example of a bird that we tagged in Salt Lake City. We named Grogu, is a Harlan's hawk. And you can see here that it took this route north, very similar to its route south. So there's a very tight path along the Front Range throughout Canada to its breeding grounds in Alaska. These are two other Harlani that we captured in northern Idaho. And you can see here that between Calvin and Hobbs, there's a very different migration route and also a very different breeding grounds. The other cool thing is that Hobbs has breeding grounds in Western Alaska, and he takes in this year, he took a spring migration route through the center of British Columbia, and then his fall migration route went around the Front Range on a totally different track, whereas Calvin went on this really tight, same path, north and south. We don't understand what drives these. Is it the same for these individuals every year, or does weather impact it? These are the types of questions we're able now to start answering on a large level because we've tagged so many birds, and these are things that we didn't know before. So we'll have some things coming out about this moving forward. So these types of questions intrigue you, stay tuned. Another aspect of our work is actually helped by tracking technology, and that's helping us understand the distribution of plumage polymorphism in the species. Now, you all understand that you see dark and light birds there in California, but this question about the distribution of polymorphism is really one of the first things that that drove us to start this working group and start working together to answer these questions. And that's because if you go during the winter to places in eastern Kansas, Oklahoma, those areas, you see a lot of dark birds. And that sits well east of where we understand the distribution of polymorphism is. And birders have long asked the question about where these individuals that are dark that winter in these areas, where do they breed? Do they come from the mountains in the west, or do they actually come from directly north? We tagged a bunch of individuals over the years, and we figured out that most of the dark birds that we see wintering in eastern Kansas, for instance, follow this northwest trajectory north during spring and end up breeding in places where we understand that plumage polymorphism already occurs, places like Alaska and northern Canada in the west. Birders in the east, though, they see dark red tails every year around the Great Lakes, even in New York, where I'm at. Birders have really been intrigued since the 1800s about where these dark birds nest, but nobody's ever documented a nesting bird, a nesting dark bird anywhere in the east. So the question is, are they following the same route? Do they originate far, far west and for some reason go very far east? So what we did is we went and captured a few individuals, which I will say that we were only able to capture 4. However, I'm extremely proud of the fact that we caught 4 because these birds are quite uncommon, and anytime you want to catch a particular individual, it's very tricky. And so we were able to catch these 4 individuals and put transmitters on them and see where they went to breed. And we found out that they actually went and they spent the summer in eastern Canada, which is previously undocumented. So in this image, you're seeing those tracks north of these dark types that we tagged up to all the D1, D2, D3. That's where they spent the summer. The light tan marks are all individuals that are light that we have tagged in the same area, so you can see where they spent the summer. So what you can get from this is that these dark birds are spending the summer intermixed with these light birds that spend the winter in the east as well. The question we needed to answer then was, even though they're spending the summer there, are they actually breeding? Are they part of the breeding population? So I'm going to show you some information or some figures that help us understand whether or not they're breeding. I know none of you, maybe some of you have experience with home range analyses or know what you're looking at when you look at a 95% kernel density polygon. For those of you that don't, I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to walk you through how to interpret these figures. So these home ranges during the summer can help us determine nesting behavior because we can predict that the bird should behave a certain way if they're nesting. For instance, this bird is a second cycle is what we call it, but the 2C there just indicates that it's a bird in its second year of life. It's in its second cycle. It's also a male. And we know that red-tailed hawks from previous research, they generally don't start breeding until 3 or 4 years of age. So we don't really expect this bird was going to breed. And sure enough, it went north. Sorry, let me just break down this figure a little bit more. So this dark contour line here, this indicates the 95% confidence interval where that bird has spent 95% of its time during the time period that we've been to these locations. This particular one is for an 80-day window meant to capture incubation and when the nestlings are in the nest. So this is where this bird is spending 95% of its time. The darker colors indicate areas of high use. And then this number indicates that that is the area that it's been spending 95% of its time. So it's 95% of the time during this 80-day period, it was spending in about a 10,000 square kilometer area, which is massive if you think about it. Which helps us understand that that bird probably was, well, almost certainly wasn't breeding. And that is what we expect from all the light individuals we had at that age. And sure enough, that's what we saw. But this individual here below has an even larger one, almost 100,000 square kilometer home range during this 80-day period. So these second cycle birds are not breeding, they're just wandering around. Older birds, on the other hand, are much, much smaller. So you can see here on the left, I have the dark birds, on the right, I have the light birds, and I also have an example of a male and a female. Male red-tailed hawks, if you didn't know this, they provision during incubation. So they're going out and doing the hunting, and they're bringing back the prey to the female at the nest. The female doesn't do any hunting while she's incubating or in the first part of when she's raising nestlings. She's trying to keep them warm and keep them dry and keep them protected. So we expected that we would see different home range sizes between males and females. And sure enough, that's what you see here. So you see here that the two males have comparable home range sizes, about a 20 square kilometer during this time period. And then the areas of high use are generally kind of centrally located around that nest site. You can see the females have strikingly small home range sizes during this time period. 1.86 square kilometers for this dark female indicates that during this period, she was on that nest the whole time. So just think about that home range size versus that almost 100 square kilometer home range size, 100,000 square kilometer home range size for that, that young bird. So taking together all the data that we have for all these birds, you can see here that we gained some insight into individuals that are dark breeding in the east, in that, well, we showed for the first time for this species that females do indeed have smaller home range sizes during nesting than males, which we expect, but it's cool to see given our data. And then dark morphs are not different than the light morphs in their home range sizes in this area, indicating that these dark morphs do belong to this population and are breeding in this area, which is something that people have been, like I said, wondering since the 1800s about, since they saw dark birds in the east, and really helps us understand the distribution of this plumage polymorphism in this species, that it actually looks something like this, where we have dark individuals of low frequency occurring throughout the Canadian boreal, all as far east as Quebec. This is important for understanding, having more power to understand why we see this trait in a species. So why do we see multiple color types in some populations and not others? Now that we know that they occur at low frequency in some areas, they're there, but they're not common, that gives us more power to understand why. And so it's a step forward in our understanding. Here's another fun story from tracking data. This is more of an anecdote of this individual, but it's something, this individual did something that has never been documented for the species and is quite surprising. So this bird, we tagged it as a second cycle. It was a young bird in its second year of life. And again, we didn't expect it to breed. We tagged it in this area in northern Idaho. And in the spring, it went north along this really neat track along the coast of Alaska and British Columbia, island hopping along the way. And then it ended up on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, where it spent the summer. The next year, it came back south for the winter and ended up wintering in a totally different place from where we caught it, in Montana. It then took a totally different spring track north through the center of British Columbia back to the place where it spent the previous summer. The next year, it did not leave Alaska. It actually spent the winter in Alaska. So you have these very different migratory routes between these species, this very different breeding or wintering locations. And then it decided to stop migrating the previous winter and stay in Alaska. and ended up breeding last summer in that same spot. So that's very, very unique. I will also say that this individual has now started moving. We lost contact with it a few weeks ago. We haven't heard from it, but I think it's moved into some area. It moved into the interior of Alaska, so it seems to be migrating again this year for whatever reason. So this is a very, very interesting plasticity in the behavior of this species, and what we really feel like for complete migrants, these birds that occur in areas far north that completely leave their breeding grounds during the winter. We think that the migratory behaviors for those species often are really fixed. And for this species, we also think that, but this bird shows us that there may be more variability in that behavior between years than we appreciated before. So the last thing I wanted to show you is my work that I'm actually focused on for my dissertation. I'm not going to go into all of it or any of the details. I'm just going to show you one thing that we found out about the species so far that's unpublished work that I've just been working on recently. It's pretty fresh results, and it's pretty fun, I think, if you're interested in red-tailed hawk diversity. Before I get into it, though, I want to make sure that everybody knows what I mean when I talk about genomics. I bet everybody has heard of the term genetics. Genetics refers to information about the gene, the nucleotide sequences at a particular gene or one or two genes on the genome. So it's a snapshot of a gene from one or few genes. It's not a lot of information, but sometimes it can be quite informative depending on your question and the gene. Genomics, on the other hand, are those snapshots scattered across the entire genome. There's different techniques that give you more information than some, but the work that I'm doing is whole genome sequencing. It's trying to get as much information on the variation on the entire genome as you can. So it's kind of the big data of genetics, and it can be quite powerful for understanding the evolution of life in general. I'm going to show you some results I have of the phylogenomics of this species. Phylogenomics is looking at the evolutionary history of the species and trying to understand the relationships between diversity in a given group. And for this, we're talking about all the variation that we see in plumage across the distribution of red-tailed hawks. The real question that we're interested in is plumage a good indicator of relatedness? So we have, again, like I said before, we have these individuals that vary subtly on the same thing, depending on where you see them across the distribution. And then we have populations like Harlan's in Alaska, or the birds in Costa Rica, for instance, that are quite different from the other red-tailed hawks. Does that mean that they are the most different genetically? Those are the types of questions that we can answer. And recall that I said that we have a few populations that are isolated on islands. And remember that red-tailed hawks generally don't like to fly over water. So what we would expect is that these populations on these islands would be the most different of all the red-tailed hawks because they're isolated on islands. Seems to make sense, but we wanted to see if that was the case in this species. So now I'm just going to transition into, oh yeah, no, I have to show you this. This is a really cool species that's found on the southern tip of South America, rufous-tailed hawk. It looks just like a red-tailed hawk. It is very similar in behavior, structure, everything, but it sits 4,500 kilometers from the nearest hawk population. There are no other red-tailed hawks in South America. This bird was described in the mid-1800s as a separate species. It's never been considered part of the red-tailed hawks. However, a lot of people have argued that it should be because of the extreme plumage similarities. So in trying to understand all the relationships between all the subspecies, I included this bird in that set to understand how related it is to the rest. Without going into details, the sampling across this crazy broad distribution that spans a bunch of different countries is really hard. So a lot of the folks that do this type of work, they turn to the museum specimens. But raptors are actually underrepresented in museum specimens. So I was concerned that I wouldn't find everything I needed, but I was lucky that I did. However, a lot of them were specimens that were collected in like the late 1800s. They're very old. So we had to do some pretty I wouldn't say fancy, but untested, it's fancy, but it's untested genomic techniques to try and get good quality data out of these old specimens, so that we didn't have to spend years and years going and tons of money going to all the different countries to get samples from the field. We combined all those tissues from the museum, from the topads, with samples that we collected on landscape from birds in North America, in the US and Canada, to try and get a robust perspective on the diversity for every single population. And without going into any details, we were able to get really good sequences from the museum specimens. And I'll show you what we found out. I'll just keep it simple and just show you this evolutionary tree. For those of you that have zero experience looking at this, that's totally fine. I'll walk you through what I think is important for you to know. The main takeaway from this work so far that we found is that the red-tailed hawks really fall out into two genetic groups, an eastern group and a western group. That eastern group, so I'll just kind of discuss each of those groups by themselves now. The eastern group includes all these samples that you can see here in the map, including the birds in the Caribbean islands, as well as the birds in Alaska. And there's a lot of mixing in the tree you can see here. There's a lot of birds that are misplaced. They're not sitting with how we would expect with their subspecies. And that indicates that there's a lot of gene flow between these populations. And if you think that makes sense, there's really nothing separating a lot of these subspecies except for differences in habitat. So there's a lot of gene sharing. And so there's not a lot of resolution on their relationships other than they're all interbreeding. The Caribbean islands, as expected, sit apart from everything in the continent because they're a little more isolated, but there's still a lot of gene sharing between the others in this group. The West, on the other hand, is more structured. There's a lot more resolution to the relationships between these individuals. And you can see all the samples that are included in this Western group. The really exciting thing, though, is you can see that these South American samples are sitting right in the middle of this group. They're really closely related with everything else, even though they sit 4,500 kilometers away from the nearest. The other surprising thing is that they sit in aside the birds in the West, the birds that you see in California. And all the samples that I used are from Idaho. So does it make sense that Idaho and Argentina are the most genetically similar among these red-tailed hawks in the Western group? Maybe not, unless you think about the biology of the species. So birds in the Western US, for the most part, are migratory or partial migrants. So a portion of the population moves south into Central America and Mexico during the winter. And so it is reasonable to think that the reason we see this relationship is because of some migratory story that resulted in a number of birds falling into South America and ending up establishing a population down there. The other thing to help support this is that these populations off the coast of Mexico are more closely related to the Idaho individuals than they are to the birds on mainland Mexico and Central America, which is what you'd expect. They're closer to Mexico, right? So they should be most closely related to those Mexican birds. But I think because they're not, that paints another story of migration from this Calurus, this Western population, being responsible for the founders that ended up on these islands and established the populations there. I'm currently working through how to test this to help support it further, but this seems to be the story, and I think it's really fun to have this perspective, something entirely unexpected for me in particular. So with that, I just want to end back on this picture to remind everybody that although, you know, we all can probably agree that this species is so awesome, probably don't take it for granted, even though we see it every day. But I don't think we really, at least I didn't recognize until I started getting into some focused research on the species that is incredibly complex, and there's so much we still can learn from this species. And even though it's one of the most common raptors in North America, there's still a lot we need to know to make sure that the populations don't decrease any further, and we can keep this common, excellent species common, and a part of our daily lives. With that, I'd just like to say thanks again for inviting me. Thanks. I've had so much support for this work from from individuals like you folks listening, that share observations with me or put your photos into Macaulay Library, to all the funding agencies that we've got. We've got so many people helping us out, and it's really a community effort. This project is really a community effort. So if there's time for questions, I'd love to answer any questions.
Yeah.
That's an excellent question. Among the many things that they're dealing with when they're moving north and south, wildfires was actually one. When I first started thinking about let me back up. I first started getting into red-tailed hawk diversity when I was counting at the Go Shoots migration site for Hawkwatch International in 2012. It was a fall migration site, and over the course of the season, I actually was able to see this change in plumage of the red-tailed hawks moving overhead. And that just sparked my interest in, where obviously these birds are probably coming from different places. The other thing that was going on that season was there was a lot of smoke from the wildfires. So I remember thinking it would be so cool to know if fluctuations in the numbers that we're seeing from day to day are because of wildfire, the things that these birds are experiencing up north during migration, like wildfire, are rerouting birds. And so this year we're not getting a lot of birds, or this year we're getting more birds, those types of changes. I think that's probably almost certainly the case, but in order to answer that, we need a lot of birds that are carrying transmitters. And we can have one bird that's tagged that ends up going through a route where it sees a interacts with the wildfire and reroutes. But until we see that 10, 20, so many times, then we have this higher confidence that actually is impacting birds. And we can say for certain that wildfires are, causing these routing changes. And we've got a lot of birds now. We're starting to move in. They're mostly in the center part of the continent, but this year we have plans to put 25 units out in the west. So we're moving that way, and I think this project, that's the goal, to have dense enough sampling that we can answer that question and many others. Yeah, it's an excellent question. So I'm actually currently working on the demographic analyses to understand what kind of population trends each of these went through and what time periods those fluctuations in populations correlate with. It almost certainly seems, at least in some part, to be Pleistocene, and related to the glacial cycles. The biogeography of the species matches many species in that a lot of the plumages are restricted to glacial refugia during the Pleistocene. So like there's a particular plumage type that's restricted to coastal BC and Haida that we know that was a glacial refugia. There's a really nice sharp break between birds in the southeast and birds in Florida. There are two different plumage types. We know that is a very well-established glacial refugia. So Pleistocene glaciation almost certainly had a role in this, and I would say I'll have a better answer in a few months. But the paper that I'm working on hoping to get it submitted before the winter's out. So it should be out for publication, by this time next year. That'll tell that story. I get this question every time I share this stuff. It's a good question. And I think that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be quite reluctant to change the status of that species. Once this is published, you kind of have to do something, because if there are two distinct groups and there's a species that's part of the other group, you either have to split the red-tailed hawk into two, or you have to lump the rufous-tailed hawk. Given the amount of gene flow between the two eastern and western groups and the level of similarity between them genetically, it doesn't make sense to me to lump them at all. So if I were to write a proposal, which I think I will, it would be to lump rufous-tailed hawk with red-tailed hawks. I still think, though, you're going to get a lot of people that are, even despite their extreme genetic similarity, they're not going to like that decision because of how removed they are from all the other red-tailed hawks. A really interesting parallel is the Galapagos hawk. If you don't know about the Galapagos hawk, it has a similar story to what I'm showing you with the red-tailed hawk and the rufous-tailed hawk, in that it was a founder event from Swainson's hawks, and it genetically, actually, given mitochondrial data, it is what's called polyphyletic, meaning it sits just like the rufous-tailed hawk with the red-tailed hawk, right in the middle of a bunch of red-tailed hawk samples. So phylogenetically, it is a Swainson's hawk. It should be considered a Swainson's hawk, but nobody is going to split that, or nobody's going to lump that with Swainson's hawk, because it morphologically is very different from Swainson's hawk. It has huge feet, a huge bill. They're all dark now. Structurally, when you see them in flight, they don't look like a Swainson's hawk structurally. So they went under some extreme selection when they ended up on the Galapagos Island that quickly caused this morphometric change where they don't look or act anything like that species, even though genome wide, they are a Swainson's hawk, if that makes sense. So what will happen? I'm not sure, but I'm probably going to suggest that they're lumped with red-tailed hawk.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. So like I was saying, we're just let me just back up. The species has always been thought to be a creature of habits, because you probably have some experience with red tails, but I've just heard countless stories of people saying that they have the same hawk that shows up in the same tree every year, or on the same power pole every year. So from these wintering birds, we kind of have this idea that these birds are coming to the same wintering territory every year. And we might expect that they would also be following the same route every year because they're creatures of habit. We're finding that that's not necessarily the case, that there is variation there between their routing, but it is remarkable to see individuals that are following almost the same path between spring and summer, and also between years. We haven't done any like comprehensive summaries to look at a species trend, describe whether or not it's most common that they're following those tight lines. But I do know that they also go to the same stopover sites every single year. So they learn, I think, these routes that work for them, these stopover sites that work for them, and they stick to that unless they don't need to. And I think, or unless they have a reason not to. And I think, like the question before, those reasons not to are going to be quite interesting if we can get enough birds tagged to answer it. The reasons might be big changes in prey, or they might be wildfire, things like that. But yeah, I think it's these birds, they just kind of figure out what works and they stick to what works. I'll finish up by saying that young bird that we tagged did completely different things every year. And compared to the adult movements, that's crazy. That's not what we see with adults. But we also don't have many young birds tagged. So there might be some learning involved in that. So all these young birds might be doing wildly different things every year until they figure out what works for them, and then they stick to it. These are kind of for me, that's super interesting. It's fun to figure out. And I think we're going to start putting together these stories over time.
Thank you so much. There are no other questions. Wrap up for today. Thank you again, Bryce. It was amazing.
Yep, thanks, everyone.